This would be the best way of demystifying science and scientists and upgrading science society's scientific literacy. In summary, putting a stronger emphasis on formal science education and on raising the general cultural level of society should lead to a more enlightened, knowledge based society. I don't necessarily get that proven from this particular article, but let me continue. So, this has been on my mind for a little while, and this is going to be a little bit more of a philosophical tangent of a video. A while back on this channel, I did a video on something called actionable science. Um, and it certainly is interesting, and I've been revisiting it lately because it prompted a question in my mind of, what is the role of science in society? And or more precisely, what is the role of scientists in society, if you will? Um, and it's an interesting question because it's something that's actually pretty hotly debated through the history books as to what exactly is the role of science as it pertains to society and scientists as it pertains to society. Um, because as I've argued on this channel, science as the process, not science as the discipline, science as the process is in existence to pursue the truth. It's a process by which we get at the truth with respect to particular questions, not everything, but that doesn't answer the question of, what is the role of that in society, right? And what is the role of scientists in society? And what is the role of science, the discipline, in society? And I'm prompted to think about this because of this thing in the NIH Library of Medicine, the most important application of science from 2014. But I will tell you, this is a pretty interesting and somewhat hotly debated question because it goes back to Plato versus Aristotle, to be honest. Plato, in his beliefs of what made a good government and things like that, he very much believed in those days it was more about philosophers than scientists, but philosophers should be the kings and running everything in society because they are enlightened ones, they're knowledgeable and everything like that, and because of that knowledge they will guide everything appropriately, so they should be the ones governing. That was Plato's view. He was very he could be very considered very authoritarian in his views. And I think if it were to go between like the left and right of political in the US today, I think Plato lines up more with a lot of the things of the political left, but I could be wrong. I would leave that to others. Just more so just commenting on what Plato thought the role of philosophers should be in society. Aristotle, on the other hand, had a very different view because he viewed the ideal government as being the ideal governance of society as being more of a constitutional democracy or close to it. What he described was something close to what we would call a constitutional democracy, not a pure democracy. He was not a fan of that. But in that constitutional democracy where everyone is equal under the law. Not meaning that everybody has equal talent or abilities or knowledge or what have you, but everybody is equal under the law, and that certain institutions should be governing things, certain institutions bound within rules and law. Aristotle there's a lot of things about the way Western societies developed that goes back to Aristotle, though certainly not entirely everything. As I mentioned on this channel, the history of science and the scientific method is far more than just Aristotle, and far older than Aristotle, to be honest. But that's a whole other thing. You can go back to that video on this channel. But the question then, role of science and role of scientists in society, there's a couple of different ways of thinking about it, right? So, like, this comes from the American Meteorological Society. In broad terms, there are two possible goals for engaging the policy process and two primary strategies for achieving these goals. The goals are either to improve policies that affect science, policy for science, or to improve policies that can benefit from scientific understanding, science for policy. Scientists attempt to achieve their goals by either providing information, educating policymakers about science, or by championing particular policy outcomes by using persuasive arguments, political pressure, or positive incentives. this is a very different way of thinking about it because, they're obviously talking about how do you influence policy with science. But that runs up against what we've called about the normative principle of disinterestedness, right? Where you are not corrupting the research with your own self-interest, and that includes being pressured to do certain things. Um, yeah, the need for societal decision making. Okay, wait a minute. Most scientists recognize that the pursuit of objectivity in research, though perhaps impossible for any human to fully achieve, is a cornerstone of science. Science generates knowledge and understanding by attempting to eliminate potential sources of bias, often through controlled experiments. This pursuit of objectivity increases the credibility of scientific advances and expands society's willingness to take up and use the new knowledge and understanding science provides. Not necessarily on the last part, but this is pretty close, I would think. I think to what we're talking about with objectivity. Um, the need for societal decision making to go beyond objective information contributes to a long running and often contentious disagreement within the scientific community about the appropriate role of scientists in civic discussions. Some argue that scientists should maintain their objectivity by avoiding civic engagement altogether, or by focusing exclusively on providing information relevant to civic discussions. This helps, the argument goes, to ensure that scientific insights are free from external influences as possible, or as free from external influences as possible, and are perceived as unbiased, accurate, and legitimate. Other scientists argue that membership in society confers a right or even a responsibility to engage more actively in civic discussions. Hang on. There we go. Scientists possess specialized knowledge relating to societally relevant topics and best understand how to integrate that knowledge into decision making, this argument goes. Direct participation increases the likelihood that society will make choices to help manage risks and realize opportunities. Even among scientists disposed to civic engagement, differences arise based on the range of ways scientists can choose to participate in policy discussions. The difference between scientific debates and courtroom advocacy is particularly illustrative. So, this is that's a nice kind of overview of the argument, because there is the argument that, hey, scientists should just be, we should not engage, but at the same time that doesn't work because scientists are by nature also citizens of whatever country in which they reside, and so they do have an interest in the way things are governed, so you can't entirely remove that. Where it gets difficult is when you're talking about what levels of civic engagement. There is quite a range in the literature of where that falls and how much scientists should be involved in the societal discussions and decision making in particularly in republics and constitutional democracies and what have you across the world. And it's difficult. There's not really okay. Here's what I can give you on that. My general kind of thing with this is that the role of science in society and scientists in society, in terms of their professional knowledge and expertise, should be to focus on providing the guidance aspect. I kind of fall more in Aristotle's camp, if you will. Not to directly control what the policy is, not to directly advocate for one particular policy over another. In your professional capacity. Obviously, you cannot do so. You cannot, in your personal capacity, do the same thing. There has to be that separation there for the individual scientists that do that. But that's my kind of feeling on this. But there's also the recognition here, because you got to think about the things like scientific innovation can provide great technologies, provide cures for diseases, all those other kind of things that are practical benefits. But a lot of young scientists, at least pre the kind of postmodernist era that we find ourselves in. And this comes from 1995, so that's kind of why I was thinking of it. It's before a lot of crazy postmodernist stuff started getting into STEM in particular. I have so far focused on practical outcomes from scientific research. However, I feel I must, as a scientist, close with another dimension to the scientific enterprise, that of the discovery of new knowledge for the sake of knowing more about the universe in which we exist and mankind's place in it. Most of the scientific community does its work for the joy and satisfaction of learning what no one has known before, or of doing something that no one has done before. It is that motivation that drives the young scientist to the typical 60 to 80-hour work week, not the technologies that may come from his or her scientific work. This urge to understand is part of the human makeup and should not be ignored. We have a long tradition of exploring the unknown that goes back as far as recorded history. Our lives are enriched by the understanding that this exploration brings. And that's the other thing, is that this is what I mean by the zealous pursuit of the truth when I'm talking about it in terms of the purpose of science. You're just after whatever the answers are to these questions that nobody's ever asked before. So you're trying to figure out how to answer them and get at what the truth actually is about why this thing works the way it does, in particular in physical sciences, or why the world is the way it is. It doesn't come with an activist dimension of wanting to change everything. That is a way that scientific knowledge could be used, is to try to make things better and to try to provide technologies and all this other kind of stuff. That's true. But that doesn't mean that's what the purpose is, or what a lot of scientists want who are really dedicated and passionate researchers. And part of the reason I'm couching it right now like this is because this is 1995, of course. This is before a lot of the kind of postmodernist related stuff started rising in STEM and a lot of the things that we see now, whereby there is a lot of impetus toward, science has to help society make its decisions and provide actionable science. Is the idea that scientific research is done with the specific decisions in mind. And so you are doing research to inform somebody's decision, is the idea. Whether it be an adaptation, a resource manager, city planner, or all the way up to, high government. That's the idea with actionable science. And that is less about, there's still the element there of the pursuit of the truth with actionable science, but it is not entirely just that. Basic research is about pursuing the truth and pushing the frontiers as far as you can. But that's a question, is that all that the role of science is? No, I don't think that at all. That the role of science is entirely just the idea of pursuing the truth. And this author actually acknowledges that here. I think it's in the paragraph up above. It's like science comes into the picture through economic growth. And that brings his point to, how do you view science in society? How do you view these kinds of things? What is the role of scientific enterprise in society? And I come back to this because this was I'm not going to go through all of this because it's actually really quite long, as you can tell. But there are some key kind of things that I wanted to point out because it brought up some interesting thoughts that I hadn't considered before, which is part of the reason why I was like, oh, this would be fun for a video. But the other thing is that there's also some things in here that I don't very much agree with. So let's see. The most important application of science, comes from the NIH library. Science is valued by society because the application of scientific knowledge helps to satisfy many basic human needs and improve living standards. Finding a cure for cancer and a clean form of energy are just two topical examples. Similarly, science is often justified to the public as driving economic growth, which is seen as a return on investment for public funding. During the past few decades, however, another goal of science has emerged: to find a way to rationally use natural resources to guarantee their continuity and the continuity of humanity itself, an endeavor that is currently referred to as sustainability. Now, yeah, there is some interesting things I could say about sustainability. I don't necessarily, in its root concept and its original conception, I do not necessarily have a problem with sustainability. I do have a problem with some of the ways sustainability is being used now in terms of political governance and things like that, but that's a whole other thing for another time. Let's see. What the scientists often justify their work using these and similar arguments, currently linked to personal health and longer life expectancies, technological advancements, economic profits, and/or sustainability, in order to secure funding and gain social acceptance. They point out that most of the tools, technologies, and medicines we use today are products or byproducts of research, from pens to rockets and from aspirin to organ transplantation. This progressive application of scientific knowledge is captured in Isaac Asimov's book, Chronology of Science and Discovery, which beautifully describes how scientists shaped the world from the discovery of fire until the 20th century. However, there is another application of science that is largely ignored, but has the enormous potential to address the challenges facing humanity in the present day education. It is time to seriously consider how science and research can contribute to education at all levels of society, not just to engage more people in research and teach them about scientific knowledge, but crucially to provide them with a basic understanding of how science has shaped the world and human civilization. Education could become the most important application of science in the next decades. So this was written in 2014, for the record. Here, just to help go with that. But it is time to more and better education of citizens would also enable informed debate and decision making about the fair and sustainable application of new technologies, which would help to address problems such as social inequality and the misuse of scientific discoveries. For example, an individual might perceive an increase in welfare and life expectancy as a positive goal, and would not consider the current problems of inequality relating to food supply and health resources. Oh boy. This is what I mean. This is where I would have to ask the question, what do you mean by education? But to get to go back to the point of what this video has been about, the author's pointing to another role of scientists in society, and I think I'd have to go back and check the arguments of Plato and Aristotle again, but I do think there was something similar in that, scientists can help to educate others, kind of thing, and there was a similar kind of argumentation when it came to philosophers between Plato and Aristotle. The thing that we have to ask here is, what are you calling education in this case? Because if you're calling what education currently is in K through 12 schools in the US, I don't think so. And a lot of the most brilliant scientists in the world were not necessarily classically educated, as we talk about. Some of them were not experts in their field when they made the breakthroughs in what they became known for, in a couple of different fields and disciplines. So let's see here. However, taking the view that science education should address how we apply scientific knowledge to improve human condition raises the question of whether science research should be entirely at the service of human needs, or whether scientists should retain the freedom to pursue knowledge for its own sake, albeit with a view to eventual application. This question has been hotly debated since the publication of British physicist John Burnell's book, The Social Function of Science, in 1939. Burnell argued that science should contribute to satisfy the material needs of ordinary human life, and that it should be centrally controlled by the state to maximize its utility. He was then heavily influenced by Marxist thought. The zoologist J.R. Baker criticized this Burnellistic view, defending a liberal conception of science, according to which the advancement of knowledge by scientific research has a value as an end in itself. This approach has been called the free science approach. The modern utilitarian approach has attempted to coerce an explicit sociopolitical and economic manifestation of science. Perhaps the recent and striking example of this shift is the European research policy under the so-called Horizon 2020 or Age 2020 funding framework. This medium-term program, 2014 to 2020, is defined as, quote, financial instrument implementing the Innovation Union, a Europe 2020 flagship initiative aimed at securing Europe's global competitiveness. This is a common view of science and technology in the so-called developed world, but what is notable in the case of the Age 2020 program is that economic arguments are placed explicitly ahead of all other reasons. Europe could be in danger of taking a step backwards in its compulsion to become an economic world leader at any cost. For comparison, the U.S. National Science Foundation declares that its mission is to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, to secure the national defense, and for other purposes. The Japan Science and Technology Agency states that it, quote, promotes creation of intellect, sharing of intellect with society, and establishment of its infrastructure in an integrated manner that supports generation of innovation. Okay. The difference between these declarations and the European H20 program, H2020 program, is that the H2020 program explicitly prioritizes economic competitiveness and economic growth, while the NIH and JST put their devotion to knowledge, intellect, and improvement of society up front. Curiously, the H2020 program's concept of science as a capitalist tool is analogous to Bernalistic approach and contradicts the liberal view that science can only flourish and therefore can only confer the maximum cultural and practical benefits on society when research is conducted in an atmosphere of freedom. By the way, the discovery of laser emissions in 1960 was a strictly scientific venture to demonstrate a physical principle predicted by Einstein in 1917. The laser was considered useless at that time as an invention in the search for a job. Okay. So, first off, a comment on the thing here with the capitalistic and the Marxist. The vast majority of major scientific breakthroughs and inventions in history have been produced under constitutional republics, democracies. In here, a lot of the great ones that we find in the last century have been produced under governments that are not monarchies with the last century. So I'm talking about the 20th century to present kind of thing. And I go there because, of course, it was in the 20th century to present where we had the rise of communism, socialism, and Marxism, which stifled a hell of a lot of growth. Let us recall, of course, the story of Trofim Lysenko, considered the most murderous scientist in history because of his devotion to Marxism and his devotion to ideology. State-controlled science generally doesn't work in the sense that it forces everybody to go along with one particular view. You don't have the freedom to explore. You don't have the freedom to explore the bounds of research and the frontiers of scientific knowledge. Capitalism, you have more of that, so long as you can justify people spending the dollars on it and get the funding for your research. Yes, it's a pain in the butt, but at least you still actually do have some freedom to work with, so long as you can convince others that it is something good, and by others, often it's funding agencies in the US and Europe, convince others that it is good and worthwhile. Putting that aside, there's kind of a few different views of science that come out here. The utilitarian, the role of science and scientists in society is the utilitarian kind of thing of just practical benefits and what have you. There's the free science approach. And the ultra utilitarian, crazy state controlled thing, of course, is where the state should direct and guide everything so that everything comes out for the benefit of its people. And so there's no creativity involved there. No creativity and no freedom to think. And then they add the other view in here of the notion that it should be also the role of science should also be about education, providing good education for all of these different things. And this is where I find it interesting, actually, when I was reading this earlier today. In a more general sense, education serves to maintain the identity of human culture, which is based on our accumulated knowledge to improve the general cultural level of society. Again, with what's going on in K through 12 schools, I kind of doubt that education is doing that right now, at least in the formal education sense. And the reason I say that is because, let me see, National Education Report Card, I think, what was it? It was either 22 or 24% of grade 12 students are proficient in science in the US, according to most recent data we have. Let's see. When discussing education, we should therefore consider not only those who have no access to basic education, but a considerable fraction of population in developed countries who have no recent science education. Okay. Ignorance may have a relevant influence on politics in democracies because ignorant people are more easily manipulated or because their votes may depend on irrelevant details such as a candidate's physical appearance or performance in public debates. Democracy should be based on an informed society. Education sensu lato, including both formal learning and cultural education, is therefore crucial for developing personal freedom of thought and free will, which will lead to adequate representation and better government. Now, he's not wrong, actually. Democracies and constitutional democracies and republics don't work unless the society is informed and educated. They just don't. They tend to fall apart because then people get manipulated. So, let's see. To improve the cultural level of human societies in a long-term venture in which science will need to play a critical role, we first need to accept that scientific reasoning is intimately linked to human nature. Humanity did not explicitly adopt science as the preferred tool for acquiring knowledge after choosing among a set of possibilities. We simply used our own mental functioning to explain the world. If reason is a universal human feature, any knowledge can be transmitted and understood by everyone without the need for alien constraints, not unlike music or art. Moreover, science has demonstrated that it is a supreme mechanism to explain the world, to solve problems, and fulfill human needs. The fundamental condition of science is its dynamic nature, the constant revision and reevaluation of existing knowledge. True. Every scientific theory is always under scrutiny and questioned whenever new evidence seemed to challenge its validity. No other knowledge system has demonstrated this capacity, and even the defenders of faith-based systems are common users of medical services and technology facilities that have emerged from scientific knowledge. For these reasons, formal education from primary school to high school should therefore place a much larger emphasis on teaching young people how science has shaped and advanced human culture and well-being, but also that science flourishes best when scientists are left free to apply human reason to understand the world. This also means that we need to educate the educators, and consequently adopt adequate science curricula at university education departments. Scientists themselves must get more involved, both in schools and at universities. Now, I actually am going to say right now that that is absolutely true. And for a couple of reasons. I've talked about it here on this channel a few times that, you know what, I never learned the principles of science I never learned the normative principles of science when I was an undergrad. I never learned about the history of science. I never learned a lot about the philosophy of science. Things that I'm learning now that I wish I would have known back then to develop my understanding of this and the love of why you do the research and all this other kind of stuff. Things that I really wish I would have known. So I actually don't disagree. I actually do think that scientists should get involved to a degree in schools and universities, particularly lately with the postmodernist related stuff and the woke related nonsense that, as I have said in other videos, is very much anti-science because it corrodes human reasoning and engages in logical fallacies to the nth degree, which is going to be detrimental to scientific research and knowledge and technology and all that, technological development and all that in the next coming decades. But I actually don't disagree with that statement, that I do think we should have more scientists involved in K through 12 education, and also in university education departments, talking about what science is and doing a history lecture on that. Scientists will also have to get more engaged with society in general. The improvement of human culture and society relies on more diffuse structural and functional patterns. In the case of science, its diffusion to the general public is commonly called the popularization of science and can involve scientists themselves rather than journalists or other communicators. In this endeavor, scientists should be actively and massively involved. Scientists, especially those working in public institutions, should make a greater effort to communicate to society what science is and what it is not, how it is done, and what are its main results, and what are they useful for. This would be the best way of demystifying science and scientists and upgrading society's scientific literacy. In summary, putting a stronger emphasis on formal science education and on raising the general cultural level of society should lead to a more enlightened, knowledge-based society. I don't necessarily get that proven from this particular article, but let me continue. As opposed to the H2020 vision of a knowledge-based economy that is less susceptible to dogmatic moral systems. Scientists should still use the other arguments, technological progress, improved health and well-being, and economic gains to justify their work, but better education would provide the additional support needed to convince citizens about the usefulness of science beyond its economic value. Science is not necessary for humanity to not only necessary for humanity to thrive socially, environmentally, and economically in both the short and the long term, but it is also the best knowledge, the best tool available to satisfy the fundamental human thirst for knowledge, as well as to maintain and enhance the human cultural heritage, which is knowledge based by definition. Okay, so to finish this up, there's a lot of different views on what the role of science is in society, and they're arguing that science needs to take a more active role in education. I actually kind of quasi agree with that to a degree. Where it gets dangerous is that that must not come to be an activism base where you say what you believe the world is. If you're going to be teaching science education and giving more to that education, doing what they're talking about, you have to basically act like, for lack of a better way to describe it, you have to act like a scientist. You have to talk about what is true and what is not true, not what you wish the world would be, not the postmodernist nonsense of everyone creates their own reality, because that is completely unstable. And yet that happens. You have to teach reasoning, and yeah, you got to get in there, but at the same time, you got to be really careful about the civic discussions in science. And the reason I say this is one of the primary norms of scientific research is the idea of disinterestedness. Again, the idea being that scientific research should not be corrupted by anybody's self-interest, whether it be I'm doing this for the money, or I'm doing this for political interest, or I'm doing this because I want to see this particular um, policy implemented. Because when it starts being done for your self-interest, that's where the research can become biased, and you are, instead of basically figuring out what is the answer to the question that you're asking, you are instead trying to push what you prefer the answer to your question be. One, those two things may very well not be the same thing. And so if I were to say the role of science in society, I do stick to the fundamental thing of Aristotle, that its primary purpose in society is to provide guidance for decision making, but it cannot be, nor will it ever be, the only thing by which people make decisions. And beyond that, I do think scientists should have a role in education, particularly when it comes to science. They can probably teach a lot, and a lot better than a great number of K through 12 teachers. Not to say there's not great K through 12 teachers. I'm sure there are, and I know a few myself. But given that 24% of grade 12 students are proficient in the U.S. in science by the time they graduate, we can do better than that. Perhaps the scientists should get involved in K through 12 education, actually teach what science is. Just a thought. Let me know. What do you think? What do you guys think? What do you think the role of science and scientists is in society? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious, everybody.